I think one of the challenges that we don't really think about is that because the pill is shutting down normal ovarian function, what happens is that if there was an issue at play, it can do a very good job at masking it.
Yeah.
So you could have, and a lot of women are put on the pill not for contraception these days. They're put on the pill because they had really ridiculously painful periods, or they put on the pill because they had acne, or they're put on the pill because they had irregular cycles, or because they didn't know when their next cycle was, or because they stopped menstruating altogether. They'll just put them on the pill. And so if you had some sort of issue and that was why you were put on the pill, one of the challenges with fertility isn't that the pill is causing you to be infertile, but the pill could be masking whatever that was.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Tracy Donegan. Today I'm speaking with Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner. Lisa is the founder of the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program and the author of 3 best-selling books, The Fifth Vital Sign, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, and her most recent book, Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with Lily Nichols. Drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to help women connect to their 5th vital sign by uncovering the connection between the menstrual cycle, fertility, and overall health. With well over 4 million downloads, her podcast, Fertility Friday, is the #1 source for information about fertility awareness and menstrual cycle health. And now I bring you Lisa Hendrickson-Jack.
Everyone, you are very welcome back to the Tracy Donegan podcast. And today I'm continuing on this focus on fertility, specifically female fertility. And I'm delighted today to welcome Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who is joining me from Toronto, Canada. Lisa is co-author of this incredible book. And I'm just like, we were just talking before we came on about the fact that it's now an audio book and it might take you a couple of years to get through it. I'm so impressed by these 2 ladies, Lily Nichols as well, that the work that has gone into this. So if you are dealing with fertility challenges or want to just learn how to eat well as a woman, this is a absolutely priceless book to get your hands on. Lisa, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for such a lovely introduction.
So before I go on, tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to co-author this book. I know you've co-authored others and have many, many strings to your bow and talents and training. So please have at it.
Well, I'll make it short and sweet. I'll try. So, I mean, in terms of my charting background, I started charting my cycles when I was very young. I feel very fortunate to have discovered it around the age of 18 or 19. And so that's how I kind of started off. I was charting my cycles. I was in university. There was a group of women on campus who were teaching this. So I started, stalking them. And then I was part of the group. And then we took a training program together. So my early 20s, I was doing like the grassroots coffee shop teaching fertility awareness charting. But this was before Facebook, like this was before all that stuff, right? So I didn't think of this, I didn't see the possibility to do this as a career. But then fast forward to when I was actually, I was married to my husband. We started trying, we had our first son. And that was when I realized, I have been taking this for granted for a decade. I've been able to chart my cycles, understand what was going on. And when I looked around, I realized so many women were struggling with fertility issues and very few of them had this basic information. So that was the start of my podcast. I wrote my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign. And so along there, Lily was one of my very first guests when I had my podcast. And she's probably the most frequent guest. So she's probably been on the show like 6 or 7 times now. And so she actually reached out after she wrote her first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And, I asked her to send the book, and I didn't realize this, but she shared that I was the first person who ever asked for like a book. I was like, can you mail me the book? And she was kind of like, man, am I mailing a book to Canada? And, but I loved the book. And then we had a great interview, and obviously that started a friendship. And so there was this one time where we did an interview and we were chatting afterwards, and I can't remember if I think it was probably her, I think it was. I was telling her, I was like, you need to write Real Food for PCOS. I was like, that should be your next book. And she was like, no, I'm not writing that book. But she's like, but I do want to write a book about pregnancy. And I was like, oh man, this was before I wrote The Fifth Vital Sign and before she wrote Real Food for Pregnancy. And I was like, I've wanted to write a book about, all the things. And so like, I think it was like the next day she reached out and she's like, all right, let's do it. And I was kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm writing a book. But so we wrote our books at the same time. We were book buddies behind the scenes. And, this was a shock to most people. I think when we released the book, their worlds were colliding. It was actually really fun to see how everyone was kind of like, oh my gosh. But that's how it came about. And so, we wrote those books as book buddies. We saw what came of them. Her Real Food for Pregnancy is just an incredible resource. It received, so well received, and it's gone on to do so much. And The Fifth Vital Sign has also been very well received, and it's done very well. And what we were finding is that, for all of my clients who are trying to get pregnant, I would give them Real Food for Pregnancy. I'm like, I know it's for when you're pregnant, but right. But then for my clients who are literally not trying to get pregnant, but they're just trying to, support hormone health, I'm also telling them to get Real Food for Pregnancy. I'm like, don't worry about the pregnancy part, just focus on the diet part, right? So I feel like in that sense, that was one of the reasons why this book felt like we should be writing it. And for Lily, she'd get a lot of questions about fertility and she would be referring them to The Fifth Vital Sign. So it did feel like exactly what our clients needed, what they were asking for. And I'm thrilled that we have it now. We both have practitioner programs. So it's literally a textbook in both of our respective practitioner programs. And there's enough data in there for it to be a textbook, but it's written in a way that's approachable enough that anybody can pick it up and enjoy it. So obviously we're both really proud of this work, and it was an extreme amount of work to get it done. And so we're very thrilled to have it out there in the world now.
Well, I will say thank you from, I'm sure, millions of women, and hopefully their partners as well, that have engaged with your content and Lily's content and this amazing book. It is, I don't like ebooks. I like to highlight and I like to scribble and write notes and that. So there's a lot of graffiti on your book. And I have to say, with Lily's books, I have I bought gestational diabetes, or Real Food for Gestational Diabetics years ago, I think, when it came out first, to help with my my doula work, my midwifery work. And then it's always been I recommend it to everybody. And then I lost it there on one of our many moves, and I'm like, I just need to buy another copy. So I got more copies now sitting in my library. I'm like, I should have asked Lily to send me one. I'm always talking about Lily, and like, her work is fantastic. But I am so happy to have you here today. So you've mentioned the fifth vital sign. What is the fifth vital sign, and why is it important for women's reproductive health?
Mm-hmm. Well, a vital sign is a way that we measure how the body is functioning. And so when we think about the common vital signs that we are aware of, we think of things like our heart rate or our temperature or our respiratory rate, the number of breaths that we take per minute. And so, I mean, I didn't invent this concept that we could and should consider the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. There are a number of organizations that are starting to recognize it as such. And so there's a lot of articles often around adolescence. So young girls, young women, when we should be looking at it that way. And there's a lot of arguments being made for when you're, a pediatrician and you're seeing teenage girls, if they haven't started menstruating by a certain age, you should be reviewing what's happening with them. And because that can be a sign of, something that's going wrong. And so essentially, I'm making that argument then in my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, that we should be looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And what's interesting about that concept is that we're looking at the menstrual cycle not as solely for fertility. Obviously, we know that it's essential for fertility, but if we look at it as a part of how our body normally functions, then we can look at the overall parameters of the menstrual cycle. So not just the length of the period, the length of the menstrual cycle itself, but we can look at the quality of your period. We can look at when you're ovulating in the cycle. We can look at your cervical fluid production. We can look at the length of the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase. And there's a lot of parameters in there that if you're healthy, if your body's functioning normally, we would expect your cycle to fall into those normal parameters in those areas. But when we pay attention to the menstrual cycle, when we track it, you can clearly see that when there are other health issues at play or other things that are going on, the menstrual cycle goes awry. So in that way, it does respond very similarly to your blood pressure.
Hey there, if you're enjoying this conversation and are passionate about evidence-based care in labour, the best way to support our work is to subscribe and share this episode with other amazing women in your life. Your support is so important to us and helps us reach more mothers with empowering content. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button and spread the love.
So if you think about, as an example, the blood pressure, if you go to the doctor and the pressure is too high or too low, it does provide that general information that there's something that's going on. But if it's too high, the doctor also knows of a couple things, reasons why it could be high specifically. So in the same way, I mean, one easy example would be if you learn about cervical fluid, and cervical fluid can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like the clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. And so if you're healthy and your cycle's normal, you would expect to see that cervical fluid during your fertile window as you approach ovulation, because we produce it in response to rising estrogen as we approach ovulation. If you see something like that every single day, even that basic observation could be an indication of a yeast infection, or maybe there's, something going on. Maybe there's some dysbiosis or something like that. And, even to something more complex, like if you're of reproductive age and all of a sudden you stop menstruating, you're not pregnant, and you don't menstruate for 6 months or more, that can be a sign of hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is commonly caused by undereating, overexercise, or stress. And if we look deeper into that, if a woman stops menstruating and then doesn't menstruate for 6 months to a year, she's at a greater lifetime risk of developing osteoporosis. So I think that it is really useful to look at the menstrual cycle in this way. And a lot of the feedback that I've had from just putting this information out in this way is that it inspires women to start looking at their bodies and their cycles differently, because all of a sudden, after years of being taught that it only matters if you're trying to get pregnant and you shouldn't even worry about your cycle and you should just be on the pill all the time, they start to realize that we can actually learn a lot by paying attention to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I even, in my, midwifery training, we have a focus on preconception care, but we didn't do a huge amount on natural fertility. And, I think most of it we kind of went and learned ourselves. But you just mentioned the pill there. So can you talk a little bit about how, because there's all kinds of debate on the contraceptive pill and how it can impact our health and long-term health, and especially if we're putting like young girls on the pill early in their lives. Can you talk a little bit about how that can impact our, just our overall health, especially if we've been on it for a long time and then decided, it's time to plan a family and expect that it's just going to happen. I know it does for some, but
I mean, there's a whole lot that I can say about the pill. I think one way to look at it is the first drug that was ever invented or created to shut down a perfectly normal, healthy bodily function. So I don't think people know that. Before the pill, medications were specifically geared at illnesses, problems. But the birth control pill, like, you have a healthy woman with a functioning endocrine system, right? A functioning reproductive system, and we're shutting it down. So that's something to think about. And the birth control pill, it works primarily. So there's a lot of different combinations of the hormones. So, if we just go with the combined synthetic estrogen progestin formulation, so it works primarily by shutting down ovulation. And it does that by interfering with the communication that's supposed to be taking place between the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and ovaries. So that's the primary function. And then, secondarily, it prevents the full development of the uterine lining. And so if you think about it that way, well, there's no egg. And then if somehow something were to happen, the implantation would be quite difficult because you need to have a certain thickness of the uterine lining for that to happen. And then it also prevents the development of fertile quality cervical fluid. So, I use analogies to get points across a lot. And so, I have this silly analogy where, if I had a cottage, by the lake, and I go up there one year and I discover that I've got this leak. And so the water main is broken. It's spilling all over my house and it's awful. So, in my brilliance, I decide that I'm just going to shut off the water. And that's the solution. So that's what the pill is doing. It just shuts it up. It just shuts it down. Like, oh, you have irregular cycles? Let's just shut down the whole reproductive system, right? Let's just completely turn it off. And so then, I'm excited about my decision to shut off the water. But obviously, I go up there the following year. If I haven't fixed the pipes, then what's going to happen when I turn back on the water? And so this is like one of the challenges. So with the pill, when you look at the research, there's no research that would suggest that the pill has permanent negative effects on fertility. So, there are temporary effects when a woman comes off the pill. We could talk a little bit about the post-pill transition phase. So if a woman's been on the pill, in the research, interestingly, they define long-term as 2 years or more. And most women who take the pill, for a while, it's often more than 2 years, right? So there is a temporary transition phase that we can talk a little bit about. But I think one of the challenges that we don't really think about is that because the pill is shutting down normal ovarian function, what happens is that if there was an issue at play, it can do a very good job at masking it. So you could have, and a lot of women are put on the pill not for contraception these days. They're put on the pill because they had really ridiculously painful periods, or they're put on the pill because they had acne, or they're put on the pill because they had irregular cycles, or because they didn't know when their next cycle was, or because they stopped menstruating altogether. They'll just put them on the pill. And so if you had some sort of issue and that was why you were put on the pill, one of the challenges with fertility isn't that the pill is causing you to be infertile, but the pill could be masking whatever that was. And then when you come off of it, if your period, like, you're much more likely to have a period be delayed, or, in terms of when it's going to return, if you did have some of these other issues. And so what we're not factoring into this is if you are already predisposed, you had some sort of symptom issue, you were on it, it doesn't fix it. It just kind of kicks the can down the line. And then when you come off of it, maybe it takes your body a bit of time for that first ovulation to take place. And then maybe your cycle's still irregular, and it could take a bit of time for that to resolve. So I think a lot of women unwittingly find themselves in that scenario. Obviously not everybody, though. For some women, they just use it for birth control, and maybe they, maybe they had pretty typical cycles and they went on the birth control pill, not immediately after their first period. Maybe their bodies were able to normalize and, but after being on the pill for a long time, we do see some of those temporary effects that I was talking a little bit about. So I like to look at the research on this. You've probably heard a lot of these stories as a midwife. I've spoken to so many clients over the years who they just had this feeling like, I've been on the pill for so long, I don't even know what my normal cycles are like. So they, call their doctor, make an appointment. I always emphasize this. Like, you literally had this feeling, but it was strong enough to make you make that phone call. You called the doctor, and then you made this appointment. Like, you got up that morning, you took a shower, you got ready, and you drove downtown, whatever. And for the doctor to tell you like, oh, no, it's fine. Just stay on it until the moment that you're willing to try, and you'll just get pregnant right away. So I like to just point out that a lot of us do have that intuition where we're kind of like, this is unknown. I haven't had a real period in a long time. I don't really know what my cycles are going to be like when I stop. Should I come off of it early? But we're always reassured that it's fine. So I like to look at what the research has to say. And so, in Real Food for Fertility and the Vital Sign, I outlined a couple of these research studies. So there's different ways that the research addresses it. There's one type of research where they look at time to pregnancy. So one thing about these time to pregnancy studies, though, is most of them don't break down the month by month, month over month time to pregnancy. They'll just kind of lump it and say, in a year, X% of women were pregnant, and so it's fine. But there was this one study that actually did break down month by month, and it was interesting because it also looked at multiple methods. So it looked at condoms, which is obviously just, you just stop using the condom. It looked at the combined, estrogen, progestin pill. It looked at an IUD. It looked at the implant. It looked at the shot. And what that study found was that women who took the pill, so the combined pill, it took on average twice as long for them to conceive. So the couples that were using condoms, on average, it was 4 months from when they stopped using the condom to conceive. And then for the women who were on the combined contraceptive, particularly too, there was a difference between, like, again, long-term and short-term. So the 2 years or more versus, but on average, it took about 8 months instead of 4 months after coming off the contraceptive pill. So that means obviously some people did conceive sooner, but it also means that at a year, some people didn't. And then the shot was the worst offender. I'm not a fan of the shot at all, but on average it was 18 months and that's not a surprise to anyone who kind of knows that, because it does take much longer for the cycle to normalize after the shot. So that is useful information, because what happens in a woman's real life, as we know, is that many of us have just avoided pregnancy like the plague in our, teens, early 20s, right? And so the whole plan is just to avoid it. We've been drilled in our brains that we can get pregnant on any day of the cycle. There's no safe days. Like, that's what they told me in junior high, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And now I feel like the younger generation of women are even more scared, because now when I was in school, at least they told us condoms could work. So at least I left school thinking condoms were like a legitimate choice. The younger women now, they're told that condoms, no, you have to use the pill with the condom, right? So they're totally just terrified all the time. So we go from that now to coming off the pill, and we think that we're going to get pregnant right away. So month 1, we're good. We're like, okay, that makes sense. But month 2 of trying after the pill, you're starting to get a little worried. And I've seen it. Month 6, we're already at the fertility clinic. And nobody told you that there was this post-pill transition phase, and it could take a little longer for the conception to happen. And again, it's not to say everyone has difficulty getting like that. Please don't take that for what I'm saying, but it's just this information. Like, if you knew that there was this phase, and so there's other studies. So this is a topic that I can talk a lot about, but I'll just share. So I shared the time to pregnancy study, right? So there's 2 other interesting ways we can look at this. One is there's a few studies that look at the menstrual cycle characteristics. So they're not looking at whether the woman is conceiving, but they're just saying, okay, so how long before the cycle gets back to normal? Before the cycle is of normal length, before there's normal mucus, before the luteal phase, the second half of the cycle, is normal. And so there was an interesting study that found that compared to women who had never been on the pill, the women who came off the pill, it took an average of 9 to 12 cycles before you could look at the data and they looked basically the same. So that's interesting, because that means that it actually takes some time for the cycles just to get normal again. And then the scary stats, there's interesting fertility preservation data. So you have to look hard, because when you're looking at research, sometimes you have to kind of say, well, where's the money? Who's paying to do the study? So fertility, right? IVF. So that's where there was an interesting study, and there's several of them where they have women who are wanting to freeze their eggs. So and if you think about it, a young woman in her 20s, maybe she's on the pill and she wants to freeze her eggs. So they want to know, like, if you come off the pill and directly do that procedure, are you going to get the same results as if you waited? So this one study had the women do it like they were testing their ovarian reserve numbers, their anti-Müllerian hormone, their antral follicle count, and also the ovarian volume. And so immediately off the pill, those numbers are very low. The ovarian volume, so in case this is the scary stat where when you're on the pill, it shrinks the ovaries by 50%. So the ovarian volume is significantly less. So that's one of the scary stats. Like, oh my gosh. The good news, I suppose, is that the research doesn't indicate this is permanent, but this is something, if you think about what I said earlier, the pill shuts down ovarian function. So you have like these dormant ovaries that are not ovulating. So it's not outside the realm of, like, if you think about it that way, it's like, oh, well, I guess if you're not using them for a long time, maybe that's why. Anyways. So the same participants then at 7 months, they tested throughout. They tested, I think they were testing on a monthly basis, but by the 7-month mark, the results started to normalize. And so they found that if the women did the egg retrievals 7 months out of coming off the pill, their ovarian reserve parameters were significantly better, and they would have, just a much better crop of eggs, and the procedure would be a lot more successful. So surprise, surprise, the researchers suggested, I love reading this stuff. It's like, so we suggest that if women are doing egg preservation, that they should consider coming off the pills, several months before, so that they'll have better results. But then when you are trying to get pregnant naturally, no one is telling you that information. All of a sudden, the advice is totally different. And you can tell that it's just ridiculous. So I like to look at what the data has to say. And according to all of that stuff that I just shared with you, I feel like the better recommendation out of that would be that when we are thinking about conception, we should be considering coming off birth control at least 6 to 12 months ahead of time if we're able to do that. And then I argue that if you had a specific issue, like if you know that you had problems with your cycle, whatever those problems may be, irregular, severe period pain or whatever, then you probably want to consider coming off a little earlier. And that is a challenge because you could potentially get pregnant. So you want to make sure you have a birth control method that's intact, in like a good birth control method or a good plan with your partner. But these are the things that we're not being told.
No, we're not.
No one's talking about this stuff.
And that's all very scary. Not even the scary data, but that's all very scary. That we have literally divorced women from their body, and then just expecting them to just start communicating again. Like, you cannot mess with the brain and mess with the hormones of the body and just expect it to just naturally fall back into again. That's depending on kind of the reasons for starting the contraceptive pill. But that's yeah.
And I mean,
So
it paints a scary picture, but I just want to put, like, our bodies are really resilient. So I'm not standing here saying like it's hopeless. Like, that's not the message. The message is just that we need some time. Like, we just need that preconception phase. Like, that's all we're arguing for. We're arguing for a time of deep nutrition and a time of giving your body a break from those hormones while you're actively avoiding pregnancy. Because if you think about it, this is a realization that I came to. I mean, when I was getting married to my husband, we took all this time to plan the wedding and whatever, but there was never a conversation about planning ahead for the babies. And it's a human being that you're growing with your body. And you'll never do anything else that requires as much deep nutrition as building an actual human being, And so armed with this knowledge, it just gives us the opportunity to plan our families in a very thoughtful way. Nobody wants like the bare minimum when it comes to their children. We want to do the absolute best that we can to ensure our children are as healthy as they can be and ensure we are healthy, because, we always think about the baby. I also think about the mom. Like, I have 3, like it is busy in my house and I'm tired a lot, even when I'm nourished. So how would I feel if I wasn't nourished? We really have to look out for each other as women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when, especially for fertility, for anyone who's considering starting a family in the next, couple of months or next year or whatever, it is, I agree. It is like, there is nothing bigger than building a human, and it's, Casey Means has a great way of describing, which is, because she's talking about, real nutrition for women, especially, when you're trying to conceive, that when you are, when you're pregnant, you have to think of like you are literally 3D building a baby just from everything that's coming into your body, like in the environment and the nutrients, which I thought, God, that is, you are 3D building a human.
It's like, what did you do today? Well, first of all, I 3D printed a human with my body. And second of all, I was making food for that baby all day long. I'm still breastfeeding my daughter, who's a little over 2. So like, what did you do last night? Well, my body still makes milk. What did you do?
Yeah, I have so many superpowers that we don't. How long do you have?
I know, right?
So I guess the women that you work with, like, what would be the most common issue that you come across? Would it be, irregular cycles? Is that kind of the or not ovulating? Is that the biggest kind of issue that you see at the moment in kind of modern female health?
Well, there's quite a few, I think. So what comes to mind, there's a lot of kind of low progesterone concerns with luteal phase, concerns with, so like low progesterone is associated with things like spotting before your period and increased PMS and things like that. And that whole concept of hormone imbalance, I think, is related to that as well. So that's certainly a thing. Absolutely irregular cycles, women who have delayed ovulation or irregular ovulation, and women who, what Lily and I talked about in the book as well in our HA chapter is this concept of the HA spectrum. So I see a lot of women who maybe they're not exercising enough to fully lose their period, but they exercise enough that it could be disrupting that hormone balance, and they could start seeing some cycle irregularities, or they might start to see some luteal phase issues, shorter luteal phase, things like that. And I don't know what it is, but perimenopause is trending these days. But I think I'm also turning 42 this year, so there's a lot of I just think there's a lot of us in the field who are now we're just getting older. Like, we've been online talking about this stuff for a long time, and so there is also an increased awareness about this. So there's a lot of women who are entering that stage who are noticing these challenges, and what I found with clients, and to some degree myself as well, because I'm entering this phase, is that you did all this stuff in your 20s, you got away with all this stuff, and then you try to like do the same stuff when you're getting older. It's, like drinking all the coffee, exercising all the time, not eating, skipping breakfast, whatever, insert thing. And then your cycles just don't respond favorably. So I would say that there's quite the gamut. And then, of course, there are the fertility challenges. Like, there are women who are trying to conceive and it's not happening. So it's across the board. There's a lot.
And then based on, because we're, whatever's going on in the world, we're looking out and we're seeing fertility levels like tanking. Like year over year, they seem to be getting worse. So is there anything like, are you seeing any trends, or is it, and I know, I think finally we're actually starting to look at male factor fertility, because we left the dudes out for a long time and put all this on the women. But are you seeing anything or anything that comes to mind, that trends that you're saying, oh yeah, is it like and I think, are women working? Are we working too hard? Are we not giving ourselves a break? We're not managing our stress. What do you see in your with your clients?
Well, I think it's definitely a combination. So I do think that we have to look at nutrition. We're in a really interesting time. Everybody is eating the healthiest diet. And if you talk to 10 different people, they will tell you what a healthy diet is, and they will give you 10 different answers. We live in a really interesting time, I think, with the social media influences. So when I was growing up, there was one TV and we all watched it. And there was one news and we all watched it. And there was one, government disseminated information or whatever. And now if you talk to 50 different people and open up their Instagram, TikTok, whatever, they have 50 different feeds. Like, everyone's getting totally different information than everybody else. And there's no overlap. Like, it's really interesting. And so with so much different information out there, I think this is one of the reasons why Lily and I are so obsessed with research, because although research isn't perfect, and we can certainly talk a little bit about some of the challenges with reading and interpreting and remembering that it's written by human beings who also have biases and things, even in terms of how they, like, you could have the same data and have like different people interpret the same data differently. But with that said, at least it gives a good foundation of, especially when you're looking at actual studies that have tested specific things, multiple studies, meta-analyses, like when you're looking at things that have been tested, repeatable, things like that, then it does give you a stronger, solid base and foundation. So I would absolutely argue that if you look at what the kind of standard American diet, as they always, I'm Canadian, but the terminology is like the standard American diet, right? If you look at the standard type of food that we eat, if you look at it from a micronutrient standpoint, even a macronutrient standpoint, like, we're not getting a protein, but beyond that, we might not be getting enough fat either. We need fat to make our hormones. We need protein as the backbone to make hormones. Like, we need these foundational things to make our hormones. But if we look at the micronutrient intake, it's significantly lower than what it should be. And so, when we look at the approach that we took in Real Food for Fertility, we're also inspired by this concept of ancestral nutrition, because there was a time when there were no vitamins. So what did people do to have healthy kids? Well, you look at what they ate. If you test the micronutrient, value of things like liver and organ meats and oysters and shellfish, and if you look at the foods that we talk about in the book and you look at the micronutrient ratios of those, you just see that that's what's lacking. So I would definitely say that there's a foundational nutritional piece that we're lacking. And when you do a deep dive into what we need to support healthy sperm, healthy eggs, healthy fertility, healthy fetal development, if you look at the nutrients that women are depleted in when they're postpartum, that I feel like that gives you a really good kind of primer as to what we need to focus on, at least to begin with. And then if you look deeper, I mean, of course, I am always talking about the menstrual cycle and how we need to understand how it works. So we have a whole, like, that's a whole conversation that we could have, where women don't know that there is a limited window in every menstrual cycle where pregnancy is possible. Women are given terrible advice. They're told to have sex every other day or have sex between days 10 and days this. Well, if you happen to have a later ovulation or, you know, something like that, you could literally be having sex at the wrong time all the time. There's a percentage of women, this is not the only, obviously fertility is a big topic, and by no means am I saying that it's only timing. But what I can tell you is that if the timing isn't correct, there's no chance.
Yeah.
So it's like timing is not the only issue, but it is essential. So we need to get the timing right. And if we're getting the timing right and it's not happening. So you mentioned male fertility. So in my work, teaching women to chart and working with women in this way, it became very apparent to me that we should be looking at the men. Because once you teach a couple when to have sex to conceive, then you have to start to wonder, because keep in mind that I started charting my own cycles when I was very young. And so I was in the like black and white, like I was immature in the sense that like, I thought it was black and white, right? Like you're trying to get pregnant or you're not or whatever. So when I started charting, I was very much like, I don't want to get pregnant. And so I was like terrified of unprotected sex in the window, like the plague, right? So I followed things properly. So you can imagine my surprise when I started working with fertility clients who were consistently having sex in the window unprotected and nothing was happening. So at some point you have to think to yourself, well, what's going on? And then when I started to encourage my clients to get their partners tested for their sperm testers started looking at the sperm tests, then you start to see like, oh my goodness. So we have a whole, like, you let me know if you want to go into some of that, but that's a whole topic and it's really fascinating. But I think for me, my experience of it was as just with the charting, because you have to think to yourself, like, if you are healthy and your partner's healthy and you're having sex in the window, it's really not going to take long for this to happen, you know? And so when it's not happening, you really have to start to say, well, what's going on? Because all of them meaning my clients who were in this position, were told that their partners were fine. And even if like, and so that's a whole conversation as well.
It is interesting. Well, and when we look at it's, I'm not sure what it's like in Canada, but there's all kinds of noise happening at the moment here in the US with really how awful the traditional American diet is. And we have this epidemic of metabolic health issues for men and women and children, which is shocking. So when I hear about, okay, women, we can chart, we can, really get in touch with our bodies, but we also have to look what else is in our environment that could be contributing to, even if you figure you're healthy and well and you go and we're using the window and nothing's happening. It's like, what are we, because when we talk about this fertility, crisis that's happening around the world, I wonder, it's like, okay, so we know our diet is brutal and it has to be changed. And this is why your book is so fantastic. But when we look into the animal kingdom, are we seeing that the same issue? Are we seeing this, obesity and insulin resistance and cardiovascular? Like, what is it that we're doing? So I think part of it is, diet is absolutely essential, and getting food from soil that is actually keeping the nutrients in our food. And then nobody is outside getting any daylight. We are sitting under the artificial lighting nonstop, which increases the stress response and messes with our hormones. I came across a funny, interesting study earlier on this morning that I was looking at around circadian rhythm. And this study that was done on mice, I think it was 2015. And they looked at if they adjust, so they, trained these mice, train their bodies almost into an infertile state by adjusting their circadian rhythm and when they were exposed to morning light and evening light. And what they found was when they went back and they adopted the circadian rhythm, which would be specifically for these mice, specifically the older mice, their fertility returned more quickly in the older mice. And I'm like, oh, so and again, like, we're going to bed with our phones and our big screens. And it's like, okay, this artificial lighting has to be playing a part in it, which I'm absolutely convinced now it does. And our constant avoidance of sunlight, so no vitamin D, no UVB. It's like, yeah, we've got to make some big changes. And you guys are doing such a brilliant job on the food end of things. It's I think it's really, I can't recommend your work enough. So for what would be some red flags that women should be kind of looking out for that might indicate there is something else going on with your cycle or with your forget about outside of fertility, but with your health? What are the kind of things that women should be looking out for in their monthly cycle, if they're having a monthly cycle?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's helpful to know what some of those normal parameters are. So, for example, a normal healthy cycle typically is about an average of 29 days, but the range could be somewhere between about 24 and 35 days, give or take. And to know what an irregular cycle really is. So a lot of women out there think that if their cycle is 28 days one month and then 32 days the next, that means it's irregular. But the definition of an irregular cycle would be fluctuation greater than 8 days from cycle to cycle, or if you have fewer than 8 or 9 periods in a year, something like that. So if you have cycles that are that irregular, where sometimes it's 45 days or 47 days, or you're skipping periods, or if you're having irregular bleeding, abnormal bleeding. One of the things that's interesting is we experience our own cycle. So whatever we experience, we might think is normal. I think sometimes we have a sense that it's not. And so if you're experiencing painful menstruation is something that obviously has been normalized. And a lot of women do experience some pain with their periods. So I think it is helpful to understand that if you're experiencing moderate to severe pain on a regular basis, especially if you didn't used to have painful periods and now all of a sudden they're painful, that can be one of the signs of potentially endometriosis, pain with sex, pain outside of your period, pain at other times in the cycle, although sometimes endometriosis doesn't cause pain depending on where it's located. So it is helpful to understand that there is such a thing as a normal cycle. And if you start to experience like bleeding all the time, bleeding between periods, pain at other times, long irregular cycles, or even really severe PMS symptoms, or different imbalances, your hormonal imbalances and things like that, it doesn't mean to say like if you experience these things you won't be able to conceive. But your question was more so, what should we be looking for? And in terms of flags, I think it is really important for anyone who is trying to conceive, or who has been trying for a while, or is experiencing some fertility challenges. I think it's helpful to know that from a statistical standpoint, if you look at couples who conceived within 1 year versus couples who did not conceive after 2 years or 3 years, statistically speaking, if you look at the men, they're not like the sperm quality is lower. So from a statistical standpoint, if it's taking a long time to conceive, we absolutely need to be looking at the partner. And the one thing with male sperm is that sometimes there's certain flags or factors that can be improved. If we are to improve those things like naturally through diet, lifestyle changes and supplementation or something like that, it can take 4 to 6 months kind of minimum to start seeing those results. So the biggest challenge is couples who have been trying for a really long time, and then after 2 years they finally get them tested. We should probably be doing that on the outset. As in Canada, for example, they recently legalized marijuana, cigarette smoking are two huge things that are known to cause poor sperm parameters. Like the one thing with male sperm is that it's something you can't take a woman to a doctor and get an egg sample. We can test the ovarian reserve parameters, but we're kind of limited in terms of those specifics. But with the male piece of it, I think people really underestimate what a big role it can play. So we went to town on our sperm chapter. Lily will remember there was a time when I was thinking about writing a whole book on it. So we really kind of put a lot into that. So if there's one takeaway for any couples who are trying to conceive and it's not happening, I would say we definitely have to investigate the man. And if you were told he was fine, you need to get your hands on the results and actually compare the results to what is optimal, because often men who are above the WHO kind of guidelines are still below what's optimal, even if they've been told that they're okay.
I love that. And I remember that specifically in the book, that I guess around these kind of, levels over the years have dropped, so what, normal, you might fall within the normal range, but like it might not, but it might be far from optimal.
Well, those are some of those scary stats for men. So, I mean, if you look at research from the 1940s, you can ascertain what the average sperm parameters were of a man back then. So in the 40s, your average man just off the street had a sperm concentration of about 113 million sperm per milliliter. These days, your average man probably has about 50, like the average 50 million. So that's like a 60 to 70% decline. So the other thing that I want to put across when it comes to the male conversation is that it's not like it's just like your partner isn't exempt, even if it's like, oh, he's really healthy. Like there's obviously a bigger problem happening if we're seeing such a significant decrease. And that could be due to the chemicals every day. Every year they come out with X thousand new chemicals, and it's in the air and it's in this, and they're all estrogenic. And spoiler alert, estrogen exposure doesn't help men make more testosterone and have better sperm. And so there's a lot of, and then you talked about the metabolic issues and all of those things, all of those factors. There's research on all of those things that you mentioned showing that men with metabolic issues are more likely to have, more sperm DNA damage. And so being healthy and being of a healthy weight and having healthy metabolism and having optimal, an optimal nutritional status, all of these things are linked to better sperm. So it's a whole conversation, but I guess the gist of it is that there's a study that kind of determined the WHO guidelines. And when I looked at that study, like basically how they came up with their normal guidelines. So the normal guidelines as outlined, the concentration, and that's the number of sperm per milliliter. They're looking for, I think it's 15 million sperm per milliliter. So I just mentioned that the average man in the 40s had like 100 times that, right? So so that there's that, right? The motility, 40%, that means 40% of the sperm in the sample are moving. So what are the other 60% doing? And then the morphology, the sperm that actually appear normal with like a round head and a tail, 4%. So like 4 out of 100 look normal. So when they determined that this was the number that they were going to use, they had a study of several, thousand couples. And they had these couples trying to conceive, and they kind of singled out all of the couples that successfully conceived within 1 year of trying. And then they took those, they took the sperm samples from those men and they divided them into centiles. And so the result, like the guidelines, the WHO guidelines represent the lower 5th centile. So if you're following me, if you go back to math class, it means that like 95% of the men in the sample had better sperm. And that 5th centile is what the guideline is. And if your partner is higher than that, he's told that he's totally fine and normal. So nowhere in that study were they trying to identify what would be optimal. So this is where we get in the difference between optimal and what they like the guidelines. And so if we can get our head around that, then anybody who had a sperm analysis and were told they were fine should be concerned right now. And you should get the data and you should compare it to what would be optimal. We talk about that in the book. And then you have a better sense of like, because there's no man alive that's so healthy that he can't benefit from improving his diet or, taking some targeted supplementation, like period.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I found that fascinating. It's like, oh gosh, we are because in my own fertility challenges, and I had the hysterosalpingogram, and I went to all of this testing, and it was like kind of an after fact. Oh, we should like test him too, but it just means that there's so much focus on women, and women kind of carrying most of the burden, I think, of this. But one thing that I've recently been looking at is because especially when we look at, you know, the development of the eggs and the development of the sperm, that we have, like, it takes time. All of these lifestyle adjustments and adaptation, they all take time. But there's been some recent studies on the use of red light therapy that will significantly increase motility within 30 minutes.
Wow.
And it'll last for an hour or something. Okay, get your light on, get yourself down, and give them your sample. You know, it's because again, we're just sunlight deprived, and so go and tan your junk tonight, this afternoon. Get a little light on those boys. So what would you say then to somebody who they're on the pill and they're thinking, okay, 2025 is going to be the year when we have a baby and start a family. What would be kind of your top couple of tips for where to really start with a focus on both of their health, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would certainly encourage anyone in that situation to just take some time to learn a bit more about this topic, because I would encourage you to consider coming off the pill at minimum 6 to 12 months prior to when you're trying to conceive, just to give your body time to normalize. If you were inspired by our conversation today, I think it is a good idea to you don't have to go into full fertility awareness mode, but you can learn a little bit more about your cycle, start tracking when your periods are. And that, what I've observed is that it really, by the time you get to that kind of 9 to 12 month mark, most women's cycles, at least they're cycling regularly. Some of those parameters might still not be perfect. You know, the pill can have a negative effect on cervical fluid, but typically you're in a better place, like hormonally. But in addition to that, I would strongly encourage you to start focusing on preconception nutrition for both you and your partner. So incorporating, I mean, I've had a few different interviews, and I remember one woman saying that she kind of thought like this would be another like really specific kind of rigid, like you have to eat these things and and that's not how the book is at all. We provide information about a variety of different foods that are highly nutrient dense, and then it's really up to you to determine how to incorporate those. So it's certainly not this kind of rigid approach at all. The feedback that I've had from clients and from practitioners in my programs is just that it really helps to educate us better about what the research has to say about which foods contain the nutrients that we know, based on the scientific research, are necessary for optimal development, especially with the fertility conversation, supporting egg and sperm quality, but also then when we actually do conceive, giving us the reserves that we need to support and carry that pregnancy so that we can go into pregnancy actually replete. One of the analogies that I often share is this concept of the bank account. So, you know, when you're pregnant or breastfeeding, it's just withdrawals. Like that's what's happening. You're building a human being, withdrawals are coming out. So in that preconception phase, you have this wonderful opportunity, both you and your partner, to really build up those stores so that you can fully be nourished yourself and nourish your baby. Most women are going into pregnancy not fully nourished at all. So those, if there were two specific things, we can get into a lot. If you want to get into the weeds and the specific details and the specific nutrients and all of that, absolutely grab a copy of Real Food for Fertility, because we go into that, you know, in tons of detail. But just for the takeaway for listening to this episode today, absolutely consider the choice of birth control to allow your body that time to recover, and focus on the nutrition piece. It's incredible what can happen when you focus on those two things.
Really, it is. Would you recommend that couple get a sperm analysis done now, or because I think I would want to. I would like, okay, what's the baseline here, so we know what we're working with. And
well, so I mean, I tend to not assume there's a big problem. So I tend to not want to, you know, like, because plenty of couples are going to try to, like, so for example, if you had, you know, I wish we could do our own study. Like, so if you had 100 couples and who, you know, just tried the Real Food for Fertility approach, right? Like, you know, being aware of the hormonal contraceptive factor and dealing with that, coming off ahead of time and focusing on the nutrition, versus couples that just, you know, did whatever, but didn't necessarily focus on that. I would imagine that you would have like that in and of itself can help people just get pregnant faster when they're ready. So just
Yeah.
that. So I think first of all, it would be up to the couple. Once you have learned about this, you may want to, just because you decide you want to, but I don't think it's necessary for everybody to just immediately get their sperm tested. But what I will say is that if you learn to chart your cycles and you understand how to identify your fertile window in your menstrual cycle, so you're legitimately having sex correctly and you're doing it, it shortens that recommended window. So typically what couples are told is like, oh, if you've been trying for a year, like go get a fertility test or whatever. But if you are legitimately, they call it fertility focused intercourse in the literature. So if you're like legitimately timing sex correctly based on your cycle, and it's, cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's not happening, then I would absolutely suggest to go and get get all the tests for you as the woman, and then see if he's willing to do a sperm test, because men aren't always willing to do that. But if he's not willing to do it, act as if there needs to be work, because sometimes it's hard to get, it really depends. I've worked with a lot of different couples, like sometimes the guy is really good about it, but sometimes it's like a sore spot. So if he's not willing to get tested, just act as if, and just try to get him to do some of the dietary things and all of that. But that would be a situation where I wouldn't hesitate, but I wouldn't do it immediately right off the bat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like to collect my own data. I want the numbers so I can see kind of, okay, what are we working for? And now we're going to look at it in 6 months and make sure you've been eating all the oysters. And
yes. And I find that the testing I feel like it's just motivational. So, often I suspect, you see certain things, you work in the field long enough, you kind of suspect, so the test though is what gets people to take action. Because everything's fine and we can be in la la land and we can kind of be in denial about it until you actually see the number. And then you're like, oh no, wow, that's lower than I thought. And then all of a sudden that. So I think the tests are important for motivation.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really insightful and kind of bringing back a lot of, I guess, stuff that I'd just forgotten. And because I haven't been in this kind of trying to have a baby space in a very long time. So, but yeah, because I still see kind of misinformation out there about, you ovulate on day 14. And I was like, what? Are we still doing that?
We're still doing it. I actually just recorded a podcast episode that's going to go out on my podcast. And I was reading about this specific study. So they had like 100, or no, I think it was 300 women. And it was like literally like, it was something like 12% ovulated on day 14 or 15 or something like that. So no, it's a myth. Yeah. It's not always day 14. If that's what you think, then you have to learn a little bit more.
Yes, definitely. Especially if you're trying to avoid a pregnancy. Yeah, yes, this is really homework for you. Lisa, where can people find you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This conversation was super fun. We covered so much ground. So thank you. So if anyone is into podcasts, you can find the Fertility Friday podcast. So just type Fertility Friday in your favorite podcast player. I've been podcasting for 10 years and we have over 500 episodes. It's wild. So lots of great stuff there. You can find me on the socials. I'm at Fertility Friday. And I'm trying to think, I mean, we for anybody who is, interested in real food for fertility, you can grab a copy on Amazon. As you mentioned, we did the audiobook, 19 hours of audio. And if you want, you can grab the first chapter for free over at realfoodforfertility.com. So if you're wanting to jump in there. And a fun fact about the book is that we had so many references, over 2,400 notes, that if we had put all the references in the book would have gone from 500 to 700 pages. So you can also grab our citation list from our website, if for those of you kind of nerds, research nerds like we are, for all of the references that we cite.
And then I'm pretty sure I saw on your website as well that people can download the first 2 chapters of your book as well, the Fifth Vital Sign?
That's right. So my website is fertilityfriday.com. So you can also grab, the first couple of chapters of the Fifth Vital Sign over there. And the fifthvitalsign.com, the fifthvitalsignbook.com also. So there's all the
Great.
places, but I shared the main places I think people can find me. Usually the podcast is one of the ways people find me. And if there's any women's health practitioners listening, I did create an interesting resource for them specifically. As I mentioned, I have a practitioner program now. So my main focus has been teaching women's health practitioners who are wanting to also support their clients with charting. So that's been just so much fun. And I created this resource, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you, because that's often one of the big challenges of what do I do? There's bleeding
Yeah.
over here. There's irregular stuff over there. So I created an ebook. So you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart if that interests you.
Fantastic. Lisa, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. Remember, empowerment begins with knowledge. If you enjoyed our time together and want more content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. So stay inspired, stay informed, and until next time, take care of yourself.